I'll jump into some of your questions. There's so much going on. And I'm going to try and pull things together, not just with what you asked, but some of the things you didn't ask. I will tell you, I didn't stand a chance today of covering everything you asked, simply because so much is going on, but I'll do what I can. So, first of all, people asked about the Supreme Court, especially why the Supreme Court appears to be interested in setting Trump up as a king. And I want to be really clear on this. When they decided Donald J. Trump versus United States in July of 2024, they really did set Trump up to be a king. They said that that a president, although that wasn't, it was pretty clearly aimed for Trump or another right-wing president, could not be prosecuted for crimes committed as part of his official duties. And those would be the official duties that are enumerated under Article 2 of the United States Constitution. Remember, the Constitution has a number of articles. The first one is about Congress's rights, duties, and privileges. The second, Article 2, is about the president. And then, as I always like to joke, Article 3 is about the judiciary. But by then they were tired. So they basically said, let's have a judiciary. And then they turned around and went home. And that is important for where we are right now, because the powers that the U.S. judiciary has now, most of them, not all of them, some are enumerated in the Constitution. I'm not sick. I just breathed in something when I came into this place. But because those rights were not, or what the judiciary was going to do was not enumerated in the Constitution, what happened is that Congress, under the Federal Judiciary Act of, off the top of my head, 1789, don't quote me on that one on Jeopardy, because I'm dragging it out of somewhere, that lumberyard that is my brain. But in that, they began to establish a federal judiciary. And then in 1803, in the Marbury versus Madison decision, the Supreme Court gave to itself the power to decide whether or not a law was constitutional. And I'm not going to go into the details of Marbury v. Madison now, but the idea of judicial review comes from that 1803 decision. It's not in the Constitution. And that matters, because that whole idea that the courts are what get to decide whether or not something is constitutional comes from the judiciary itself, not from the Constitution or from Congress. All right. And I may or may not pick that up again now, but have that in the back of your heads. Because what you saw with the Donald J. Trump versus U.S. decision, which is such a great title, by the way, I mean, it's so perfect. It so perfectly encapsulates what's really going on here, is that they said a president cannot be held accountable for crimes committed if the president is acting under Article 2 of the powers enumerated in the Constitution. And that's one of the key pieces to that is they said, well, because we've never decided this way before, it's ultimately going to be the courts that decide what is part of those duties and what is not. So they were basically taking power for themselves even more than they were giving it to the president. But what that did is it completely overturned the American concept, the very concept on which our government is based, that no one is above the law. In fact, that decision said, well, actually one person is above the law. And this is how we got to where we are now, which is a president who seems to be virtually completely lawless. But what you were really asking about was the case that was, the case that is before the court right now, the case that was argued, I think, yesterday in front of the Supreme Court. As you know, I lose track of the short-term dates. I believe it was yesterday. And that is the question of whether the president can fire officials who are staffing the nonpartisan agencies created by Congress. And so what that means is that when Congress decides that something needs to be done, and I always like to pick on the EPA here, the Environmental Protection Agency, it really doesn't have the bandwidth to sit there and say, well, let's talk about how many particles per gazillion that we should have of this particular chemical in, a body of water. That's not a politician's expertise. So what the government has done actually since the presidency of George Washington, our first president, was to create agencies that would do that. And what they do is they say, we want to create an EPA. and we're going to fund it. We're going to put money toward it, and we're going to tell it this is its portfolio. This is what it is supposed to do. It's supposed to make sure, and it's going to be much more specific than I'm giving you here. But they're going to say, we want clean water, we want clean air, we want clean dirt. You make that happen, and we're going to give you enough money to hire, and I'm making this number up, 100 people. And that's up to you. We'll put somebody in charge, and that person will hire scientists and whatever. And you will make the regulations that will keep this, that will put in place the requirement that we just gave you, that we have clean water, clean air, and clean dirt. But Congress always housed that in the executive branch. Now, the executive branch is one of the three branches of government, and it is the one overseen by the president. But it's not just the president and the cabinet and their staffs. It's actually quite a large branch of government. So the Congress is the legislative branch, and the judicial branch is the courts, but the executive branch has always been where all those agencies lived. But Congress would set up these agencies and they would put them in the executive branch. But crucial to that was the idea that they weren't overseen by the president. The president's job, according to the Constitution, is to faithfully execute the laws. So Congress writes the laws and the president makes sure they're faithfully executed. So it seemed fine to put those agencies in the executive branch. But they lived there and they were nonpartisan. The idea is, you get a scientist for the EPA, they're not partisan. They care about their work in front of them, as most people who are scientists or very into research care very deeply about their research. That's a different thing than being a politician or a business person or whatever. And I suspect you can see that to some degree in me. Like, nothing makes me happier than researching and writing. And, the world could burn around me. And as long as I'm doing that, that's where my brain is. That's the kind of people that you have at places like the EPA. Anyway, there is a group of radical reactionaries in the United States of America who hate this system, because what happened was, during the New Deal, beginning in about 1933 and taking off under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a Democrat and a Democratic Congress during the Depression and then into World War II, and then after it under members of both parties, under presidents of both parties and Congresses of both parties, you got a real explosion in the number of agencies and the regulations those agencies wrote in the executive branch. And it created the modern American state. A recent estimate said that 94% of the regulations that we have in our country now come through these agencies that are in the executive branch. So there has been a real push to get rid of the power of those agencies. And one of the ways to do it is a concept called the unitary executive theory, which used to be a real fringe theory. And it starts to go mainstream in the Republican Party in the 1980s. And a lot of things happen in the 1980s when the Republicans who want to get rid of that government, of that modern American state. And by the way, if you get confused about me using the word state, it always used to confuse me in graduate school. In the United States, we have areas, we have 50 areas that are states, and that's a term we use for these governmental bodies that cover a certain geographical area. You know what I'm talking about: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Hawaii, whatever. Those are states. But when somebody like me refers to the state, in that case, we're thinking of the government and the apparatus of that government, not necessarily the politicians in charge of it, although sometimes. But when we talk about the state, that's what we're talking about. So anyway, those people who want to get rid of the modern American state, that is the regulations and the agencies and everything that the state does, turn to this theory of the unitary executive, in part because beginning really in the 1980s, those people did not trust the idea of democracy. They didn't want voters to have a say in it, because voters quite liked the EPA. They quite liked the idea of Social Security. They quite liked the idea of healthcare. They liked all those pieces of a regulatory modern state that reactionary right-wingers did not like, either because they didn't want business regulation, because they didn't want taxes, or because because they didn't want the idea of a society in which white people were not the top of the heap. They wanted there to be racial hierarchies, and crucially, they also wanted there to be gender hierarchies, with men being able to dominate women, especially in the 1980s. There wasn't a lot of talk yet about LGBTQ plus rights in the United States. There was certainly a lot of them. LGBTQ Americans have always had an important role in American society, and there's always been a discussion of their rights and attacks on their rights at times. But it really, in 1980s, they're really focusing on race, gender, and the economy primarily. Every time I say something like that, then my back fell and I'm like, well, wait, there was AIDS crisis. Well, wait, there was this. Well, wait, was that. So take what I just said there with a grain of salt. But the point is that those issues expanded dramatically in the 90s and aughts to throw LGBTQ plus rights into the mix as well, in a political way that they had not been there as part of modern American rhetoric as they were in the 1980s. Okay, that was a rabbit hole that I probably shouldn't have gone down. Anyway, so what happens in the 1980s is that these people who want to destroy this system begin to look at ways to make Congress less important, to get rid of congressional things like input on strikes, input on military strikes, for example. They're trying to make Congress less important by saying that the president can do anything he wants by the use of something called signing statements. If you remember those under the George W. Bush administration, that's when people really start to pay attention to them. But they're actually begin to be used during the Reagan administration, when a clerk in the Justice Department says, we can really claw back power from Congress by using signing statements to say that even though Congress wrote a law this way, this is how the executive branch is going to interpret it. And the person who wrote that was Samuel Alito, long before he became a justice of the Supreme Court. So they're looking at ways to claw back the power of Congress. And one of the ideas behind how to do that is this concept of the unitary executive. And what it argues is that, and stick with me here because it actually sort of makes sense, but but not really. What they argue is that because the president is the head of one of the three branches of government, that power is unchecked. That is, the unitary executive cannot be forced to be responsible either to Congress or to the judiciary. The Constitution says the president has to be responsible to the Congress only in times of impeachment and conviction, impeachment by the House, conviction by the Senate. Other than that, you can't tell the president that he's got to put up with an agency, for example, like the EPA in the executive branch, without giving him complete control over it. So that's what the case yesterday is about. And since 1935, the courts have said, yeah, the president has to put up with this. The president doesn't have control over the hiring and firing of nonpartisan agency officials. That's just not his job. That he can't do that. Now it looks as if the court is going to overturn that, and apparently with the argument that you need to have an extraordinarily strong president who controls the executive branch and therefore has can't be checked either by the House, the Congress, or by the judiciary. Okay, so if that's what they are doing, and there are many reasons I think that they are doing it. It might be that they started originally caring about the economy. They definitely care about race and gender hierarchies now. And there is also at least some ways in which certain of the justices are financially compromised by their relationships with a billionaire Harlan Crow, for example. So there are many reasons they might be thinking that, but there is no doubt that they do not trust the American people who have put in place a liberal democracy that protects the rights of everybody and their right to be treated equally before the law and have a say in their government. They don't like those things. They want to get rid of those. they're putting up with Trump in part because once they put him into place, they can slot in there another right wing leader that is more stable than Trump is. But this is causing a problem for them because he is so unstable. He's pushing things much further and faster than a lot of them are comfortable going. And there, I do think we are going to see pushback from them, but it's not clear what that's going to be on. And I don't want to speculate too much more on the Supreme Court right now, because I want to take that idea of the unitary executive and the idea of a hierarchy that one person controls forward into some of the other questions that you asked about. Somebody did just point out that the Supreme Court did not give the same rights to Democratic President Joe Biden that they appear to be giving to Donald Trump. And yeah, that's very much part of the idea that they're the ones who ultimately get to decide. And you know perfectly well, they're not going to let a Democratic president do anything. They're going to let a Republican president do whatever he wants. But they also, I think, are operating under the assumption that there will cease to be Democratic presidents, which is not necessarily something I will go into now. All right, so why do we care about this? Because what has happened with this concentration of power and the reinforcement of hierarchies in American society since the 1980s, we have seen the growth of this idea that there are some people who are better than others. And by definition, if there are some people that are better than others, there's one person who's better than everybody else and has the right to rule, right? That's the same theory that lies underneath fascism as it was developed by Benito Mussolini in the 1930s, primarily 1920s and 1930s. But it's also the same idea behind the American Confederacy, behind the robber barons, behind the KKK, behind a lot of religions. It's a pretty human impulse, a governmental impulse. What is unlike that in the United States and elsewhere is this notion that everybody should be treated equally and have a right to a say in their society. And that is the fundamental principle on which the founders wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But it really starts to get its energy and its real teeth in the United States after World War II. Of course, it's a real burst by the 14th Amendment in 1868, but it gets its teeth after World War II for a number of reasons. But it really takes off in the United States after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which puts the power of the federal government behind the idea that everybody has a right to have a say in their government. And that takes a while to percolate through the states and so on. But what you're seeing now and began really to see with the rise of the radical right in 1980 is a pushback against that idea that, Black people, brown people, women should have a say in society and should have a right to be treated equally before the law. With that, that idea that this is one of the ways that radical right managed to garner power in coming up through the 1950s after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, but really taking off in the 1980s, is by convincing people through the heavy use of right-wing media, talk radio, for example, and then the Fox News channel by the mid-1990s, that this attempt to have a regulatory state that provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure and regulates business and protects civil rights is a form of socialism because it requires tax dollars to put that system in place. And that system protects Black people, brown people, women, and now ethnic and gender minorities as well. So they really hammered on the idea that Americans who fell into one of those categories were somehow lesser than those white guys. They were primarily white men who were articulated as being the people who were really driving the economy. And the reason that I am really pushing on this is because that idea that a liberal democracy that protects the rights of everybody is somehow hurting a nation that is made up of white men who are driving the economy and, paternalistically taking care of those people they dominate, has pushed the radical right in the United States very close to governments like Vladimir Putin's in Russia or Viktor Orban's in Hungary, with the idea of going to this state that is dominated by a Christian although Christian's a real slippery term because lots of countries are practicing different kinds of Christianity, something that Christians in the United States who are trying to dominate the government rarely talk about. Well, whose Christianity are we talking here? And this is spoken as a historian who knows that people literally killed each other over when you were supposed to baptize somebody, which doesn't make a lot of sense to non-Christians and people who aren't in those different sects. But it's one of the reasons that the founders were adamant that we did not want to have an established religion in the United States, is because they remembered the wars of religion. Anyway, you're seeing people in the administration push toward that idea of imposing on what was a liberal democracy in the United States this hierarchy in which white Christian men dominate the rest of society. And that brings me to the next question you asked, which was the national security statement. That's not the name of it, the national security strategy document that the White House released very late on Thursday night, which was interesting because normally there's a lot of fanfare when they release this. In this case, they kind of slipped it under the door. And I noticed when it dropped, because I love foreign affairs documents. I just love them. And I literally will drop everything to read one. So the minute I saw it on social media, I dropped everything. I was writing about something else. I dropped everything and read it. And what really jumps out, first of all, is it was meant to be a position paper, really. It's very simply written and some of it even appears, I didn't check it, to have been written by AI, because it's very general and really not very well written. But then it goes on to talk about creating an America that looks very much like a fascist state. They talk a lot about, a certain kind of family. They talk a lot about objecting to immigration. They talk a lot about restoring what they call Western values. They attack Europe for having liberal democracies that welcome immigrants. There's all that stuff going on. But there is also very clearly two things going on. One, an attempt to move the United States close to Russia, which has been the project of the Trump political movement all along. And that's itself a longer story that I really wish people wouldn't forget about. This is very well established. It is the Senate Intelligence Report on Russian intervention in the 2016 election is the only intelligence report ever published by the Senate in which every member of both parties signed on to it. I mean, it was unanimous. This happened. And this idea that it was somehow a hoax is, Trump rewriting history. So it moves the country closer to Russia. It also changes the orientation of the entire globe, or purports to do that, by getting rid of the post-World War II rules-based international order that underpins things like the United Nations, for example, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The idea that countries have the right to have other countries respect their borders and their sovereignty economically and socially, and that if those are breached, there will be an international outcry against it. Now, not everybody signs on to these things, and every country, I shouldn't say every country, many countries, including the United States, have broken those rules throughout the period since they went into effect after World War II. But what they did was they involved the United States in a global web of trade and exchanges, both soft power and hard power of defense, that created sort of a web that held the world together in such a way that it prevented another major world war. That was the whole point. And it's worked really for 80 years. Now, Trump is trying to throw that overboard and go back to the system that existed before that, in which great powers carved up the globe into spheres of influence. And he clearly is trying to grab South America for the United States, and probably to try and get Canada and Greenland as well. I think that's all part of a piece. This is a world that Russia wants, and Russian officials came out after the NSS came out and said, yeah, we're in agreement with this. It is one that would involve the breaking up of, it would give Xi Jinping greater control of Asia. It would give Narendra Modi more control of India. It breaks up that idea we all got to cooperate and says we're just going to be in our own independent spheres. But observers point out that this is the exact same world that got us into World Wars I and World Wars II. So one of the things that I was quite appalled really by the NSS, but it didn't surprise me. I will point out to you though that always remember when you're talking about documents like this, none of them is the end game. None of them, I mean, everybody wishes they had the final say, but there are demonstrations of opinion and power. Since then, we have seen Congress releasing its final version of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. And the NDAA is not an appropriations bill. It seems like it should be. It bugs me every time. It's not. What it does is it says what Congress wants the Department of Defense to do. And it says, here's the places where we're going to spend money. Here's how much we want to spend on it. And then they have to do another bill that actually raises that money. But in the NDAA, which the final version of which, and it is expected to pass, that came out on Sunday, in fact, it pushed back against the NSS. It provided money, not tons of money, but it provided money to Ukraine. It reinforced a lot of the things that the NSS from the White House had thrown overboard. And it also pushed back ever so slightly on Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's apparent refusal to release the video of the September 2nd strike on the boat that killed the 2 people after the first strike that had killed 9 people and disabled the boat. They basically withheld 25% of Hegseth's travel budget until that thing appears. It was a way to say, hey, we're not going to go along with everything you've said, like we have been doing all along. So it was a bit of a pushback. But there was also something interesting in the Inspector General's report from the Department of Defense last week about Hegseth's use of Signal in March, when he used his personal cell phone and the Signal app, which is an unsecure messaging app, to share details about the government's strike on the Houthis in Yemen on March 14th and March 15th. And in that, the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, the acting Inspector General of the Department of Defense, basically said, Hegseth really badly screwed up, put our troops at risk. Because he's a defense secretary, he can declassify whatever he wants, but which Hegseth went on to say, well, see, everything was declassified, so I didn't do anything wrong. And the Inspector General said, yeah, he's allowed to do that. But the truth is that he put our troops at risk for this. He was way out of line. He put our troops at risk. But what jumps out about the Department of Defense Inspector General's report is both that and the fact that he always refers to the Department of Defense. Never says the Department of War. He calls it the Department of Defense, which is, of course, the congressional name for it, as it should be. It's why I won't call Hegseth anything but the Secretary of Defense, because that's what he is. Anyway, that's until Congress changes the name. So those are the first 2 big questions you had, but I want to follow them up with 2 other questions that were there from fewer people, but that were still there. One of them is that this idea of that has given us the unitary executive theory and the real power moving into the presidency and so on was always fueled by this denigration of people of color, Black Americans, and of women. It's always done that. You remember Rush Limbaugh, for example, talking about feminazis and things like that. The reason I mention that is because Trump has always been a master at that. If you think about his announcement that he was going to run for president in 2016, he started out by attacking immigrants coming over the southern border. Somehow that's often morphed into attacks on Islamic immigrants. But which I always thought was interesting because people didn't seem to pick that up in the same way that the boats that are allegedly drug trafficking to the United States, although it looks very much as if they are trafficking cocaine to Europe, which is the drugs that are in that part of Latin America are not fentanyl. The administration keeps talking about how, each boat shot is saving 25,000 lives. First of all, that the numbers simply don't work. But second of all, they're trying to make people think they're talking about fentanyl, illegal fentanyl. But in fact, fentanyl comes from Mexico. The precursor chemicals come from China, but a lot of it comes from Mexico. The drugs that appear to be being trafficked across Venezuela come from Colombia and Ecuador, and they're cocaine. And that cocaine traffic tends to go, I can't do the direction here, it goes east to places like Suriname, and from there to Europe and to Africa, where cocaine use is skyrocketing. So the sort of muddiness of all drugs are bad, which is true, by the way, but it's kind of muddy what they're really doing down there. The same thing was true with Trump's, has always been true with Trump's attacks on immigrants. Like they're stealing your jobs, but they're lazy, but they're Mexican, but they're Islamic, but they're, it's all kind of all over murky and all over the map. But he's always done this. And the reason that I mention that is because if you have looked at Trump lately, he has been over the top attacking our Somali American neighbors. I mean, like really offensively. He has been going out of his way to attack disabled Americans. And I can't even refer to what the word is he uses. And he has gone out of his way to attack female reporters. What do we got there? We got the same argument that, on steroids, that what's ruining this country is people of color, women, and people who rely on a basic social safety net. And he is doing that because he's trying to reach to that base again, because his own popularity is plummeting. These terrible numbers, and the economy is not in good shape. He has taken an economy that The Economist, which is a right-leaning publication, said in October 2024, when Biden was in charge, was, and I quote, the envy of the world. And he's driven it off a cliff. And in the process of doing that, what the administration is trying to say is, well, actually, the economy's great. Today, he said he would give it an A++, plus. I forgot how many pluses there were. But they're also saying, well, we got a bad economy from Biden. We're trying to save it. In fact, the opposite is very much true. So he's got that hanging out there. He also has something else you asked about, the Epstein files. The law that Congress passed and he had to sign says the Epstein files must be released on December 19th. And you can already see this heating up. You're seeing Congress saying, hey, we're watching you. We're expecting to see this. And I can tell you which letters those are, but it's probably not worth it. Congress is on top of this. I do not expect that we're going to see them in full on the 19th. I think they're going to do everything they can to hide those. But once again, think about it. Think of how many people know what is in those files. Are you really going to be able to keep all these people silent? There were, according to the survivors of Epstein and Maxwell's abuse, there were at least 1,000 victims. How do you shut up 1,000 victims? What about the people who drove cabs? What about the money? What about the fact that all of these money exchanges are in financial files? I mean, he has got to be beside himself over that. And then there is the other problem that feeds into all this, that it is clear the man is suffering terribly in terms of his mental acuity. And you add all of these things together, and you can see him going, I got to get my base back. And then we go to the horrible things he's saying about Black immigrants, the horrible things he's saying about disabled Americans, and the horrible attacks he's making on female reporters. I think there's all a theme to that. All right, so a couple more things. I've run too long. Oh no, there's one more thing I want to get to. I'm sorry. Sometimes I feel like I should do more of these, but it's hard. There's just so many hours in a day. Um, One of the things to watch about this is there is in the news today and yesterday a really interesting exchange. And that is that the media conglomerate, Warner Brothers Discovery, that used to be Time Warner, was in talks to be acquired by Netflix. And after this happened, Paramount Sky, I always want to say Skylark, and it's not it. Paramount Sky Dance. Paramount Sky Dance, which merged last summer, and is controlled by the Ellison family, a right-wing group of right-wing billionaires, swooped in, and they want to make a hostile acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery instead. And this is really interesting because, and potentially frightening, but hold that thought for a second, because what the Ellison family appears to be doing is trying to buy up as much media as possible. Warner Brothers Discovery includes CNN, among a number of other things, the same way that Ellison bought and controls Paramount now, which was CBS. And you see how CBS turned rightward once they got it. They appear to be trying to do something similar with other acquisitions, including potentially CNN. So you're watching this attempt to create this large media ecosystem that will enable right-wing figures, billionaires, and the people who support them, people like the Trumps, who are part of this buyout attempt, to control the media, to control everything we hear. And that is of huge concern. But I will point out, as we talk about that it certainly feels as if we are in a moment of political realignment, which is what somebody else asked about, in which Americans recognize that they have been sold a story for a really long period of time, and it is not working. And this really reminds me, and I've talked about this before, this really, really reminds me of the 1890s when I've never written about this. I ought to. When the robber barons basically got their own president in the White House in the form of Benjamin Harrison. And one of the first things they do is they buy one of the major newspapers. It's actually a magazine in the country. It's called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, which is huge. It's a really big deal. And it's a kind of a secret buy. I was lucky enough to find it. And it really looks like, basically everyone's going to be force fed the media that the robber barons are producing. And instead what happens is we get a new kind of media coming from the bottom up. We get enormous numbers of newspapers coming out of the farming communities, coming out of the Black communities, coming out of the working class communities, coming out of foreign language communities, and they begin really to reestablish media of fact in the United States. And from that, we get the rise of, first of all, media like McClure's magazine, which is known as a muckraking magazine, but it is an investigative journal that says, hey, you want to know how governments work? Look at Minneapolis. It's totally corrupt. Hey, you want to know how, J.D. Rockefeller destroys all his competition? Here's an expose of J.D. Rockefeller. We get that, but then we also get the rise of a new kind of independent media that relies on fact. And that, by the way, had its own issues. But when you look at the takeover of our media by these big organizations, you, I think, are also seeing the rise of independent media pretty dramatically, with pretty huge numbers behind it, because that's what the American people want. And so I wanted to get that story out there because it seems clear they're trying to force feed us. At the same time, a lot of Americans aren't putting up with it. All right, so I always like to leave with where Oh yeah, somebody said fund independent media. 100%. Please fund independent media. But I'm going to put this out there. I see a lot of people are buying subscriptions to my Letters from an American. Please don't. You can read me for free. Buy media subscriptions to smaller people, smaller independent media that maybe aren't going to make it if they don't get supported. The day when the day comes when I need money that I don't have to do something. I'm trying to start this history video company and all that. When that day comes, I will let you know. But until then, right now, please have all your friends subscribe to me for free, but take your money to the smaller outlets that need it far more than I do, especially in this holiday season. That's what I'm going to be doing this year anyway, for the holidays. Anyway, people always ask, what can you do? And I want to call out two things that I haven't talked about before. So I always talk about how you should make friends, right? You should never try and do stuff by yourself. You should do it with people, because that's how you push back against bullies. That's how you feel good about what you're doing. That's how you build a constituency. You should keep calling your local people. You should run for office, of course, but you should call your local representatives, your state representatives. You should get involved in protests. You should definitely call your national representatives constantly. All those things are incredibly important. But I did an interview last week, I guess it was, with Mark Elias of Democracy Docket. And he reiterated, use your social circles as a soapbox. Talk to people. Make sure people are included in in the way you see the world. And that's not to fight with people necessarily so much as to make sure people are included in ways that they weren't. So one of the things that, if you read me, you'll know I'm going to be talking about tonight is a new study by a scholar from MIT and another scholar from Harvard, who says that literally the whole premise of right-wing media was to include people in politics who had never been involved before by appealing to their emotions. So telling stories that weren't true. This is Trump doing what he's doing now, right? Well, we can include those people in a different way, not by telling them to hate their neighbors, but through inspiration, telling them to be part of an organization that is trying to protect American democracy. Because one of the things that Philippine journalist Maria Ressa points out is that while fear is dramatically motivating for people to get involved in politics, so is inspiration. It's the only other thing that gets people out there in that same profound way. So you can do that, as Mark Elias says, with your own soapbox. And second of all, this was like, I felt like one of those little cartoon characters where the light bulb goes off. I got a chance to interview Zoran Mamdani the other day, and to ask him, how he was going to put in place all these things that he talks about, because he's only 34 years old. He doesn't have a lot of connections in state government or in city government, which you need to have to get anything done. It's a different skill set, getting stuff done, than being inspirational. I talk about that a lot. We need the inspirational people, but we also need those people who simply love to sit there with their big, thick binders to study which levers you can move. And I wanted to know how he was going to do it. And he said something that I was like, oh my God, of course. And I should have seen this coming. And he looked and he said, Heather, a lot of what we want to do is already on the books. It's already on the books. It's just not enforced. And that was such a light bulb moment for me. And then he went on to give examples of what sorts of things he was talking about in the city of New York, where he's recently been elected mayor. But this is exactly what Lena Khan did at the Federal Trade Commission under the Biden administration, where she said, I don't really need new laws. I need us to enforce the laws that are on the books, like the antitrust laws, like we need to go after the people who are cheating on their income taxes, the really wealthy people who get away with billions and billions of dollars a year. We need to enforce the laws that are already on the books. And that realization that when we are looking at crawling out of this hole that we are in now, one of the things we simply need to do is go back and say, hey, here's a law. Why aren't we enforcing it? Which is the exact same way that we got the second civil rights movement in the 20th century, was by people looking at the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and saying, we need to put these things into play. Literally, the laws of the civil rights movement in the 1960s are titled An Act to Make the 15th Amendment, functional. That's not exactly the title of it, but they are literally not, we're trying something new. We are reaching back to our past to do it right, to make these things really work. So I would urge you to think about the things that you care about and see if those laws are already on the books and simply not being enforced. Because all of a sudden that makes you feel a lot more powerful, doesn't it? And that is, of course, central to both changing the future, but also recognizing that while we have in this country a long history of right-wing reaction that says that some people are better than others and have the right to rule, just as strongly, we have the ideological thread that says we are all created equal and have equal rights under the law and the right to have a say in our government, as well as the right to have equal access to resources, including health care and education and so on. And that reinforcement of that strand of our history strikes me these days that we are not paying enough attention to. And you will see that somebody asked me to talk about the case in Montana, the case in Montana that looks like it might overrule Citizens United. That is a great example of a law that is it's not on the books, but it makes so much sense. And that's very quickly an argument coming out of Montana. It's important that it's coming out of Montana because of Montana's unique, really pushback against the power of big business in politics, because quite literally mining barons owned Montana for a while. And I don't have time to go into that someday. I wrote about it a year or more ago. But Montana is arguing that because states create corporations, as they do, simply a state can write into a corporation's charter that it cannot participate in government, in political activism, which is a very simple and beautiful solution to the problems raised by Citizens United. Now, that's just a case working its way up. Who knows where it'll go? But that's sort of outside the box thinking that reaches back to our past strikes me as being a really important new tool to use going forward as we work to rebuild our democracy in very new ways, but also in very old ways. And that through line is one that I feel like, ironically, even as a historian, I have not emphasized enough. And I'm going to work on doing that more going forward, because it just, when he said that, if you watch the video, you'll see I'm like, and it just clicked. It just clicked for me when he said that. So anyway, it's like I keep saying, it's going to be a haul. It's going to be rough. Lots of different moving pieces. But, somebody posted on social media the other day that he thought I had given up hope and that this was just devastating. Heavens, I haven't given up hope. If I give up hope, you're going to know, because I'm going to stop writing. I'm going to just kayak and eat M&Ms, which is what, and read books and maybe write a few. The fact that I'm throwing as much into this as I am is a sign not of despair. I promise you I couldn't write if I were despairing. It is a sign of hope. And I want you to take that to heart and join me, because it's rough. Man, you wake up every morning, you look at that expletive phone and you think, really? Are we really going to do this again today? But despite that, it does feel like an era is ending and a new one is beginning. And while certainly that could end up horrible, the opposite is also true. And at this moment in our lives and in the life of the United States of America, we still get to choose. All right. Thank you for being here. And I will see you on Thursday.